Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Objective Health. I am your host today. My name is Elliot, and I'm joined in the studio with Doug.
Hello.
So, in this week's edition, we have a very special guest. Today, we have an award-winning journalist named James Corbett. So, James Corbett started the Corbett Report website in 2007 as an outlet for independent critical analysis of politics, society, history, and economics. Since then, he's written, recorded, and edited thousands of hours of audio and video media for the website, including a podcast and several online regular video series. So, James Corbett, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you've done a lot of work over the years. You've been tirelessly shining light on the lies and the machinations of the elites, educating people on the truth, essentially. You've done fantastic work over the years, and recently you did a four-part series. It's very extensive on Bill Gates. And so I think it's particularly important at this moment in time with everything that's been going on, especially over the past couple months. And it's gained a lot of attention online. We've covered it on SOT, and it's been very well received. So first of all, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, what made you, what took you down the rabbit hole, so to speak, so that you were interested in sharing the information that you do.
Well, I guess if we're going to put it in terms of the propagandists, I was radicalized by the internet. But in more realistic terms, I think I had an experience that's probably similar to a lot of the people in the audience, which is to say that I started to discover independent news and information on the internet about 13, 14 years ago now that really started to question some beliefs and ideas that I had about the world. And the more I started to look into it, the more I found there was something to back up all of these crazy claims. So I started researching 9/11, which was something that I had not even begun to consider questioning when it actually happened. But by 2006, there was enough information online, and it was persistent enough and being recommended by the YouTube algorithm and other such things that eventually I started to click on things that I found interesting. I started looking things up for myself and discovering there was actually some there. And once you start along that process, I think it's probably similar for a lot of people. I started to become more and more interested, and I started researching over here and researching this over there. And before you knew it, I had my own website, which was something I never in a million years thought I was going to do. But here I am, and 13 years after starting the website, I've reached tens of millions of people conservatively just through my YouTube videos alone, let alone the podcast and everything else that I do. So I like to think that I know that no one out there can possibly know. Everyone thinks, oh, what if you're a controlled opposition gatekeeper that was secretly put in by the CIA to whatever. I know personally that I'm not. And that speaks to the power that we all have in this limited window of time that we have to actually break through the information control paradigms that have been erected carefully over the course of many, many decades and centuries. We have this brief window of opportunity to break through that. So that's basically the core reason why I'm here and doing what I do. And unfortunately, we're seeing that window of opportunity starting to close, and just at the time that I think things are starting to come to a head. So the Gates documentary and everything else I do is just trying to ring that alarm bell about what's coming.
And the original, looking back at the older material that you're doing, a lot of it has been focused on geopolitics, right? But it's interesting how when someone does start to uncover truths and the deception that has been going on for such a long time, it inevitably leads down many different paths. And like you said on many times, is that actually once you become interested in seeking the truth and trying to find out what is true, then inevitably opens up many doors into areas that you weren't necessarily even interested in previously. And so this has, I mean, looking at your recent work on Bill Gates and public health, it's quite fascinating how when you piece the puzzle pieces together, how everything seems to fit in such a consistent way. So it would be really good if you could just give a brief overview of what made you want to look into Bill Gates, what you've uncovered, and how you think that is important in our current time and day kind of thing.
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it, because I think you're right. What is often characterized as crackpot conspiracy theorizing is, I think, really fundamentally about the study of how power functions in our society. And that's all it is. It's not some crazy, spooky project or something. It's just what in any other era would have been seen as trying to analyze what people in positions of power are doing. But of course, you have to be ridiculed and denigrated as some sort of crazy fringe conspiracy theorist for daring to even suggest there are rich and powerful people, let alone that they conspire. I mean, it's self-evidently nonsense. And so once people break through that mental conditioning that has been raised, the Pavlovian trigger word, conspiracy theorist, once they break through that and see that this is simply about how is power operating in our society, I think people can start to see that, yes, all the pieces do fit together. And what you may be particularly interested in geopolitics, but of course that's going to impinge on all of these other different subjects that all come together. And yes, I certainly had, at the beginning of this year even, I had no intention whatsoever of doing an in-depth study of Bill Gates and the field of global public health. That wasn't my research priority at all, but of course reality, or at least the controlled reality, has intervened and forced me along this path. But as you say, it is interesting that the pieces do come together to create a picture that in some ways I realize, standing on the other side of this chasm, sitting here in the middle of 2020 rather than the beginning of 2020, I can see now that the picture that is being painted by something like this Gates documentary that I put together is essentially the picture that I've been working on for the past 13 years. It's right. Just that, now all of those pieces that I've been detailing over here and detailing over there, well, they now fit together quite, I don't want to say nicely, because of course that's not quite the right adverb, but you understand what I mean. Really, what this does is connect some of the dots that I've been seeing for a very long time between the field of public health, let's say, and the field of biometric identification, the technocracy, the police state, genetic level control, as well as the old paradigm of terrorism and the terrorist boogeyman. And all of those things are being sort of mixed and swirled into this new paradigm that is being identified right now, the paradigm of biosecurity, which obviously reaches right down into the core of who we are as human beings and how we operate in the world. And essentially, normal human activity is being pathologized right now. Just being in the company of other people can be a dangerous activity if we tell you there is a spreading pathogen of some sort that you could be an asymptomatic carrier of, and everyone must lock down when we flip the switch or push the button. That is the world that we're being steeped into right now. It is obviously requires conditioning for the public to be led along that path and controlled in that manner. So I think what we're seeing, and in fact what we've been told outright since the beginning of this crisis, is that we are going to be led through a series of essentially Pavlovian conditioning, behavioral conditioning experiences, where we're going to be locked down and there's going to be a lot of hype, and then there's going to be a release, and then we're going to be locked down again, and then there's going to be a release, and then we're going to be locked down again. And we're going to get used to this pattern until, of course, the vaccine is going to be the savior that will allow us to continue with the world. But the world will never be the same. We are being conditioned to the new normal. And I'm sure everyone in the audience has heard every step of what I've just said there, all of which would have sounded utterly ridiculous at the beginning of the year. Now, for a lot of people, unfortunately, it sounds, well, of course, that's the way it has to function. That is a remarkable propagandistic technique that's been deployed on the public over the past several months. And I really do hope that I can do something to break the conditioning that we're going through right now so that people do not simply roll over and accept it. Yeah.
It's actually interesting that, it seems like things have been leading up to this for a very long time. And, a lot of the times we hear about, or research things like, the GMOs, the fluoride, the fake food, all these kinds of things that seem to actually work into this conditioning as well. It's like there's the media aspect of it and the social conditioning that goes on, but it seems like we're also being primed from another side of things with these like the very nutrition and our lives are like conditioning us in a different way. I don't know if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're driving at. And I think all of those things are of a piece. They all fit together because, in a sense, the overall agenda, such as it can be identified, is to replace the real with the fake. And we get that not only in terms of news and information. Of course, we get fake news and fake information from the establishment that wants to condition us into certain ways of thinking and behaving. But we also get that in terms of the food that we're consuming and what passes for healthcare, and everything else in our world is increasingly being swapped out. The real is being swapped out for the fake, and we're being told that the fake is superior. And for example, just last week, just covering this on my weekly news series, New World Next Week, that I do with James Pilato at MediaMonarchy.com, we're talking about biomilk and how Gates is heavily invested in this new idea to replace breast milk with biomilk, milk with a Q, made in a lab. What could go wrong? And that's just one example of this. Of course, we see it in so many different realms. But yeah, especially in food, I think it's easy to identify there. They're obviously starting with the genomic tinkering and inserting drugs into your cornflakes, for example. How are you going to do that? Well, you genetically engineer the corn plant to express this certain gene that will provide this daily medicinal intake for you. All of this craziness that sounds total science fiction fantasy is coming true. And I am starting to see that it is really, again, it seems like an agenda of replacing reality with fake. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think the easiest reason to understand, the simplest way to understand that, is the profit motive. It's the one that most people can instantly see and identify and in some way conceptually understand. That, yeah, if you have reality with this abundant earth that can grow things out of the ground spontaneously. I mean, everything we need actually comes from what's provided to us. We don't need all of this fake artificial construct of civilization. It's nice. Obviously, I enjoy the creature comforts, but we don't need it to live. But then once they start swapping out the real for the fake, and they put in the GM Terminator seeds into the crops and things like this so that we can't just grow our own food, and all of these things that are being enabled by this technology, and then we're being sold these fake foods as real foods that can be monopolized by the handful of seed companies and pharma manufacturers and what have you. That's when we start to see, okay, so there's definitely a consolidation of power and control that comes from this. The first order effect of which is it consolidates money in the hands of these people. But I don't think that the ultimate agenda here is about money. It's just that that's the easiest and quickest way people can understand what's happening. But ultimately, I think this is about total control. You can totally and completely control the world if you can take the real, messy, actual reality that's kind of, it's out there and no one can control it, but we can create an artificial reality that we can completely control, and we can control everything you do within that artificial reality. I think that's really what this agenda is driving at. Total control.
And that's something that the average person finds very difficult to conceptualize, right? Because it's so far detached from their perception of reality. They do not seek total power. They do not seek total control. And so they find it very difficult. Humans in general seem to find it really difficult to understand that there are individuals, possibly pathological individuals from a psychological sense, who that is their main aim. And it makes perfect sense. I've heard you speak before that money is simply a means of getting more control. It's not the money. The money is not the end. These people have billions, hundreds of billions. They have more money than anyone in the world, and yet they still want more. And so you have to ask the question, what is it that's driving that? But you said something interesting before about how there's this kind of new normal, and how people have generally just, in the flick of a switch, they have come to accept these extremely draconian measures, and kind of giving away their personal power, or what little they had of it, to this kind of these authoritarian measures. Now, did that surprise you? Did that surprise you to see this with all the stuff that you know and all of the manipulation that's gone over the past decades, hundreds of years even, kind of thing? Has, people's response to this pandemic, did that surprise you how much they were willing to give over their power almost overnight?
Yes. Yes, it did. And this is coming from someone who has been deeply studying this for the last 13 years. I do a regular series on propaganda and examining the way that it functions on the public and on the public mind. I know about Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and all the people who have been for decades, centuries now, have been trying to manipulate public consciousness and steer the crowd in one direction or another. I know about these techniques and how they're being refined, and yet it still amazes me, flabbergasts me, just how far we've come in the past few months. I think that's part of it, is the rapidity with which this happened. I could understand the changeover of the public consciousness taking place over the course of months, years. I get that. But just in the course of really weeks, it was a process of a few weeks that the entire public consciousness seemed to shift over from there's some sort of thing spreading in China to suddenly we have to shut down the world economy. You will kill your grandma if you leave your house. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to believe, I suppose, that people were not quite willing to immediately change over their thinking just based on whatever the talking heads on television were telling them. I was evidently incorrect about that, at least to the extent that we can gauge public opinion accurately from what we are seeing on the idiot box itself. Will it ever tell us the truth about how much people are really going along with and how many people are really dissenting from the prevailing norm? Of course not. So we have to take that into account. But to the extent that we can gauge from our experiences in the outside world, yes, a lot of people seem to be going along with this, and that is really disappointing. The other thing that still flabbergasts me is that some of the people, even in the independent media space and people who supposedly theoretically were styled themselves as anti-imperialist or whatever, a lot of them have gone along with this and have been quick to denounce anyone who would question the validity of these noble scientists and the wonderful doctors who are our heroes and saviors who are doing this wonderful work. Yes, well, I'm not really questioning the medical profession, or at least doctors in general. I'm sure a lot of them mean well, but there are a lot of scientists who are dissenting from this. What about this guy over here? What about this guy over there? No, we must lock down. We must do it. And it doesn't seem to have bothered these people who you would think would be against a lot of governmental authoritarianism and overreach, and let alone the sort of corporate going along with this entire scheme. You would think they would start to question this at some point, even by now, when the millions of death and the tidal wave of death has failed to arrive. You'd think they would question it, but no, there's still a lot of kickback from certain circles. That has been surprising to me as well. I guess I'll have to readjust my mental calculator when it comes to these types of operations and how they can function. But I like to believe, despite it all, I like to believe that there are a lot of people who are perhaps not out on the streets protesting or making noise about it, but are not happy with the way things are going, or at least sense that there is something wrong about this. And I'm trying to reach those people because I can tell from my own metrics and how many people are contacting me and how much interaction I'm getting. I can tell a lot of people have suddenly found, oh, wow, there's this independent media that's saying different things online. I'll check them out. So I've had a lot of that feedback. That is hopeful. And I will try to use that to balance out the dread that I receive from thinking about how quickly people have fallen for this propaganda.
Yeah, it seems like if there's any silver lining to this whole situation, it seems as though it's very much given many people, it's almost acted like a 9/11 event. It seems, in my mind anyway, how you've had this massive shift in probably many people's perception of the world, and it's actually allowed them or forced them to start questioning things, and they may not have previously done that. On the other hand, you have a large proportion of the people, surprisingly, it very surprising to see, and I didn't like to see it either, but have seemingly just gone along with this whole plan. But there's that maybe there's more than we know of, but people, at least some people, have been they've been questioning things and probably stepping outside the box, and that is potentially going to snowball, I hope. And that's the main silver lining of this whole thing that I can see anyway. Now, with regard to, so in your documentary, you cover many different things. You go into the history, the ideology which drives Gates and, perhaps the people who are also pushing this kind of technology, the biometric ID, the vaccinations, the microchipping, all of this kind of stuff that was really the topic of conspiracy theory not long ago. There were people in the early 2000s who were talking about microchips being part of the long-term agenda, and people could just dismiss that as conspiracy theory. I think, I did back then. I was thinking, well, it's never going to get to that point. But as we see with this corona stuff and many other kind of seemingly tangentially related events that have occurred have kind of, they've all closed in on this now very real possibility that people will accept the kind of control which involves, microchipping, which involves contact tracing, all of this kind of stuff. It seems to be rolled out, kind of by the day. Now, with the information that you've collected regarding biometric ID systems, regarding all of these high level technologies, which are potentially going to be implemented, to enforce greater levels of control, how likely do you think it is that people, considering what we've said just previously, how people have accepted these measures, how likely do you think it is that people will accept much greater levels of control with regard to the kind of biometric stuff that you've been talking about?
Well, if we look at what has happened in the last few months as essentially a compliance test, then I think anyone who has failed the test of the past few months and is unwilling to admit that to themselves now will likely be invested for the long term in wherever this agenda is going, because it becomes more and more difficult to separate your identity from this entire agenda that you're selling yourself over to once you start to get on board with it. So, okay, well, I'll wear the mask and, I better lock down. They've told me that it's spreading and I don't want to hurt anyone. So I better do this and I better do that. And at the point where you can see self-evidently that all of the predictions were wrong, that this is complete hype, that this is not happening in the way that they told you, and you refuse to confront that cognitive dissonance that you're feeling, that at that point, essentially, they own your brain, in a sense. It's like Big Brother in 1984. I know I get sick also of hearing people talk about 1984 and Orwell, but again, it is the perfect analogy. And unfortunately, Big Brother's goal was not to simply put the boot on the face and control people that way. It was to make people love Big Brother. And unfortunately, people who have gone along with the agenda this far are going to love the Gateses and the Faucis and whoever else is in that position of authority. They're the saviors who are going to swoop down and tell you what you need. If that's a coronavirus vaccine, if that's contact tracing, that's what's going to happen. And we need that. And unfortunately, this has become politicized, at least certainly in the US. I'm obviously a Canadian in Japan. I'm watching from a distance, but I certainly see how this is being politicized. And there's a left and right divide in the political spectrum over this health issue, which in a sense, maybe that's good because it means about half of the US population at least will be against this agenda, at least for the time being. But unfortunately, it means that half of the population are just going to go along with it without even beginning to think about questioning it. Because if I question it, I'll be one of them. I'll be a crazy right-winger. I don't like that. So I better think this group orthodoxy. And it's amazing. That's one of the interesting things about this, that again, I've certainly studied the politicization of everything and how the left-right divide has been used as a divide and conquer to control the public for a long time. But still, the extent to which it's been deployed in this particular psychological operation to keep people at each other's throats is amazing. It really is amazing to behold some of this propaganda and the way it's manifesting. So to answer your question, yes, I mean, I think, unfortunately, people who have already started to invest their identity in this entire biosecurity paradigm are going to find it more and more difficult to put the brakes on it and to say, I was wrong and we should not be going in this direction. And that's why this is the precise moment in time where we need to reach people as much and as hard and as fast as possible, because we have this brief moment of respite where before the full second wave narrative hits and all of whatever craziness that's going to eventuate comes, people can see that the first wave was all hype and that it did not at all pan out the way that we were being told. This is the moment where people might have that moment of, okay, I was wrong. I won't let that happen again. But the longer it goes on, the harder it will be to reach that point.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think that's why your work and, the kind of stuff that we do as well is so important, because while there are people, I think that you're right, there seem to be some like the authoritarian follower types who really are more comforted than anything else by these kind of measures because they think that it's protecting them and making them safe, and they're not questioning it at all. But you do have other people, and I think that everybody kind of has their own different lines in the sand of things that they will cross. It's kind of like like you were saying, put on a mask. Okay, fine, I'll put on a mask, even though they may not necessarily believe the narrative or that sort of thing. But I think, the putting the message out the way that you do is going to reach those people who maybe haven't quite reached their line yet, or they've reached it, but they haven't been spurred to action yet. And for them to know that there are other people out there who do kind of think along those lines, or at least looking at things from a more wide perspective, I think it's really important to actually reach those people and let them know that they're not alone and that they're not crazy.
That was certainly my intention in creating the documentary, and that's actually why I ordered it in the way that I did, starting out simply by documenting the very documentable and undeniable takeover of the global public health sphere by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the monopolization of that sphere. Again, perfectly documentable. It's even been talked about by the Lancet, and the WHO and others have talked about this for years. So nothing to alarm anyone there, at least in terms of, oh, this is crazy conspiracy stuff, before venturing deeper and deeper and deeper into the agenda. Because I think people need to be, a lot of people need to be eased into it in that way. I guess others probably respond better to being confronted with it. But at any rate, this is the way that I structured it to hopefully draw people into the story so they see there is a much, much bigger story than what we are seeing on the surface level. And really, if I had my ultimate dream come true, it would be that I would ask people to watch How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World before they watch the Bill Gates documentary, because for people who have seen that previous documentary, that goes through essentially what I think of as the prequel to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which was the Rockefeller Foundation, and how that grew and how it functioned and how they took their enormous resource wealth that they accrued from monopolizing the energy resource of the 19th and 20th century, parlaying that into social, political, educational, and health, medical power, and using that power to consolidate more and more control in their own hands. I think that's essentially the template that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is using. So I think you see that historical parallel if you're familiar with that story first. Unfortunately, not a lot of people are familiar with that story. So, but ultimately, I think it is of a piece, and that's why I think of these almost as two complementary documentaries.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's very hard for people to get their head around the idea that a well-doing philanthropist in the public eye who's presented as a superhero in child's cartoons actually does not necessarily have their best interests at heart, and in fact is potentially ideologically possessed in such a way that their decisions are probably detrimental to a very large portion of the population. But for many people, the contrast between the facts and the perception, the public perception, which is managed and financed by that very individual, there's such a divide that it's very difficult to break that. It's very difficult to get over that, right? So you mentioned about the second wave briefly there. Do you think, despite all of the dissenting voices, especially some very well-known scientists? I mean, you've got Luc Montagnier, who is a previous Nobel Prize winner, and he has basically outright come out and said, look, this virus is, I'm pretty sure that he thinks it's man-made. There's other evidence which is going towards a line of kind of, did it escape from a lab? I mean, have you looked into that? What do you think about that? Do you know of any scientists who have kind of come out and also aired that kind of opinion? What do you think about the coronavirus?
Yes, I have absolutely looked into that. There was a questions for Corbett that I did video called something about was there foreknowledge of the pandemic, I believe is the name of the video, where I looked specifically at some of the clues along that trail. And clearly there are enough cookie crumbs there to lead us down a path that could be fruitful for exploration. And one of the things that I think is interesting and worthy of research, whether or not it is related to this story, is the gain of function research that is being done in the bioweapons laboratories under the guise of defense, of course, because it's always about defense. Well, what if the bad guys do it? Or what if nature naturally weaponizes this coronavirus? Well, we have to be prepared for it. So we have to go out and actively create the most deadly pathogen we can in order to develop the vaccine against it ahead of time, or something along those lines. Oops, we forgot to develop the vaccine. Or, I mean, there are many, many ways that could play out, obviously. But I think the bioweapons industry and the entire ecosystem and economics around that is something that's really fascinating, has not been explored nearly enough. I think there was almost the point at which perhaps with the anthrax story in 2001, there was going to be some closer looks at that entire weapons research program and what's it really doing, and is this even legal under international treaties? No, it isn't, but it's all for defense, honest. There was almost a sense where that could have really broken through, but it didn't. And unfortunately, David Kelly and others end up killing themselves in the woods and things along those lines. So there's a lot of history there, a lot of mysterious deaths of microbiologists last decade, a lot of things that we could be looking into. Does that pertain to the coronavirus specifically? I don't know. There's a lot of conflicting opinions out there, and I am not a virologist. I am not studied in these things. I am just putting out information that I find and letting people come to their own conclusions. Personally, I think if this was some sort of bioweapon that escaped from Wuhan lab or was placed in Wuhan, my money would be on that this is an accidental release rather than some sort of deliberate one, precisely because this is a mild flu, essentially. I mean, this is not a killer bioweapon like some sort of deadly super aerosolized Ebola or something. This is not killing people en masse. So I don't see the strategy behind it other than perhaps to kick up an international fuss that would lead to the point at which we've arrived at, which was wargamed out in Event 201. And for me, Event 201 remains, if anything, I think the smoking gun of this that does point to the fact that clearly there was some sort of foreknowledge of this. At the very least, it shows that there was the infrastructure laid out for them to jump on anything, any sort of new pathogen or anything that comes along, no matter how deadly or undeadly. They were going to jump on it and use it to drive this agenda. And I think that's why I think that's so interesting, and that points to some of the key players in what's playing out right now.
Yeah, and it was quite amazing to see that you had world leaders who originally came out with a specific stance, and then almost overnight, it was like they went in a meeting, and then overnight, they completely twisted or switched their position on it. I mean, I'm thinking in the UK, you had Boris Johnson, who was, I mean, we know he's just a mouthpiece, right? But ultimately, he publicly said that the UK was going to go with a herd immunity model. They were not going to close down. They were going to follow same science as what Sweden did. And then something changed, and no one knows what that is, but something changed, and all of a sudden they locked down. So it makes you wonder, what do they know about this virus? I agree. It doesn't seem that it's like a killer bioweapon. Is it having some other kind of effect? That's the kind of, I won't say imponderable, because of course we can ponder it, but it is the kind of thing that we just don't know at this point. Will this combine with something in the future to weaponize it, essentially, or what? I mean, there's a million different possibilities, and who knows what the leaders are being told behind closed doors. At least the ostensible reason for the switch of, say, Johnson and Trump and others was, in fact, the work of the COVID-19 research team at Imperial College, which was predicting
hundreds of thousands of deaths in the UK, millions in the US. And of course, that has been completely discredited at this point from the completely discredited Neil Ferguson. But it was supposedly convincing enough to these world leaders for them to suddenly jump on that bandwagon. And then for Trump to be championing the Operation Warp Speed, let's get the vaccine. Yeah, there's clearly something else going on here. But as I would hope that a lot of your audience knows by now, it's not these political puppets who are calling the shots. They are being pulled by their strings. And who are the real string pullers and what's their real agenda? That's really the question that matters.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're coming up on our time now, James. What are you working on? I know it's probably a silly question because you are continually working on things and you're continually tracking reality and trying to piece together the puzzle pieces with whatever information we have. But ultimately, you've done several of these really big documentaries. These are very much professional level documentaries that you've done, and they are really excellent. And I would recommend all of our listeners, if they haven't gone to your website, Corbett Report, to definitely go there because it is just such a rich repository of information. But ultimately, what are you looking? Is there anything that you're working on now? Is there any projects? What's going on for you?
Well, shorter term, I am going to be looking at the mandatory vaccinations and how that is going to be obviously the first order effect of what we're seeing right now. And then I also want to start looking into vaccine technologies, because what we think of as vaccines is evolving into something very different that I don't think the public really understands right now. And the future, the things that are being worked on right now, or at least that are being told to us in the medical journals, is quite chilling if you think of it from the perspective of someone who wants to control society rather than someone who wants to help society. So that's definitely part of this. Longer term, I mean, I have a lot of documentary projects in mind that I've been wanting to work on for a very long time, like a follow-up to my documentary on the Federal Reserve about the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, and how that controls the financial system as we know it. Or I did a documentary on World War I last year that I want to follow up and extend that timeline forward, and other things like that. But who knows when, if, or how I'll have the time or ability to work on that. To be honest, I'm really preparing to take a short breather here while we have a chance, because I know that as crazy as 2020 has been so far, I know we haven't seen the craziest of it yet. It's going to get even crazier in the fall. So just like I didn't possibly plan on doing a Gates documentary this year, I'm sure whatever I'm going to be doing in the fall is not something I would even be thinking about planning at the moment, because there are going to be curveballs. I can guarantee that.
Yeah. One quick question, James. We always try to kind of end the show on more of a positive note. It's not always possible, but do you still have hope, and what gives you hope, if you do still have it?
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, if I didn't have hope, what would I be doing here? Right. I mean, obviously, I have hope that this can be overcome. And my hope rests on fundamentally the human spirit. Humanity has always and will always prevail so long as humanity exists. Unfortunately, as crazy as it used to sound, humanity will not always exist. I mean, we could have imagined some nuclear event or some comet striking or something, but now we can literally think about them changing humanity at the genomic level. And that's really my worry. We do not have generations, centuries of time in order to throw off the psychopathic would-be rulers of society. No, we have to do this in short order, because really we are being changed. As swapping out the real for the fake, humanity will eventually end up with that fate, and we will have essentially transhumanism trying to merge us with the machines, and or genomic mutations trying to change us at the DNA level, and all of this craziness, sci-fi craziness. So the human spirit will prevail as long as the human spirit exists. I think at the point at which the human spirit fails to exist, well, I guess there goes my hope. But until that point, I will not give up hope.
Right.
Yeah, well, excellent way to finish the interview there, James. Thank you. Is there anything that you'd like to tell the listeners? Where can we find you? Is there anything that you feel is particularly important to share? otherwise, you've got a very large following on YouTube. How can our listeners find you and make use of your information?
Well, the best way to find me is not on YouTube, and it's getting harder and harder to find me on YouTube anyway, so just forget about the controlled platforms. The best place to find me is corbettreport.com. That's CORBETT report.com. I'm on other alternative social media platforms as well, like minds.com and Library and BitChute. But Corbett Report is the place to go. It has all of my material. It's all there for free, audio, video, interviews, everything. And I suppose if I could do anything, it would be to encourage, if people have seen the Gates documentary and appreciated it, great, please do spread it to others. That's what it is there for. It's not just to educate yourself, but hopefully to educate others. But if you are interested in going further and deeper, I would say if you haven't yet seen the How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World documentaries, please go and view that. I think it's really essential piece of this puzzle. That too is available completely for free at my website, corbettreport.com/big oil, on all one word, or corbettreport.com/Gates for the Gates documentary. And just start dipping your toe in those waters. I've got 13 years of archives there, and I think a lot of that material holds up. Some of it is even more relevant today than when I first made it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that, James. We really appreciate you coming on today. It's been fantastic having you. And as always, you do a fantastic job. We really appreciate your acting as a beacon of light for humanity, I think, and there's not that many. So in these troubling times, it's amazing to see that you keep going on. So if that's everything, we'd like to thank you again for coming on. Thanks to our listeners. That's all for this week's show. You can find us, if you like the show, like and subscribe, share it if you found it helpful. And if that's everything, then we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.